For over 100 years, on a planet far from human eyes, there lived an alien dragon. It was not like the dragons people told stories about. This one had a silver-scaled body that reflected the harsh sun and eyes that glowed faintly like embers. But despite its beauty, it carried a suffering unlike anything most could imagine. The dragon was tormented by a thirst that never went away. It had lived through decades of dry winds and scorching heat, yet it could never find relief. Every drop of water seemed to vanish as soon as it touched its tongue, and no matter how much it searched, it could not quench the thirst that had become part of its very life. The dragon remembered when its kind still gathered around rivers and lakes, sharing waters that sparkled under twin suns. Those days seemed like a dream now. The others had left long ago, leaving it behind. At first, the dragon tried to follow them, but its condition made it weak, and soon the group disappeared over the horizon. Alone, it wandered the barren lands, surviving on whatever moisture it could extract from the air or from the sparse plants that grew in hidden valleys. It learned to conserve its energy, moving slowly, sleeping long hours, and hiding from predators. Over time, it became a ghost of its former self. Feared by few and seen by even fewer. The dragon's life had become a cycle of wandering and waiting. Each morning, it would rise as the sun burned the horizon, stretching its tired wings and scanning the land for any sign of water. Sometimes it found small puddles in caves or the shallow pools left by rare storms, but the relief was always temporary. Its body absorbed the liquid only partially, leaving the thirst gnawing at its throat and chest. Nights were colder and lonelier. The dragon would rest in the shadow of rocks or inside abandoned craters, curling its long tail around its body, feeling the emptiness inside grow heavier as the stars moved across the sky. Despite everything, the dragon did not give up. It had a stubborn will that had kept it alive for so long, even when hope seemed impossible. It had watched centuries past dust storms that reshaped the land, meteor showers that lit up the night sky, and the occasional flicker of other travelers passing by, but it had never trusted anyone again. Many who saw it from a distance assumed it was fierce and dangerous, and so they avoided it. Some even tried to capture it, hoping to tame the legendary creature, but the dragon always managed to escape, using its cunning and strength. Its life became one of survival alone, a quiet endurance that no one noticed. Over the years, the dragon began to notice changes in the world around it. Plants grew thinner, rivers dried completely, and even the occasional small animals became harder to find. The planet itself seemed to be slowly dying, and the dragon's struggle grew harsher. The thirst that had been part of its life became unbearable at times, and the dragon wondered if it would ever find relief before it grew too weak to continue. Sometimes, in the depth of the night, it would whisper to itself, a sound like a low hum that echoed off the rocks. It spoke of longing, of memories of water it could barely remember, of the life it had lost. Though no one answered, the dragon's voice carried a strange power. It spoke of endurance, of refusing to let despair win, even when the odds were stacked against it. One particularly dry season, the dragon found itself in a valley that had once held a large lake. Now, only cracked earth and dust remained. The dragon crouched in the heat, wings folded tightly against its body, eyes scanning the horizon. It could feel its body weakening, its scales losing some of their luster, and even the fire in its throat had dimmed to a faint warmth. For the first time in many years, the dragon thought about giving up. It had survived storms, predators, and hunger, but the thirst seemed endless. The thought of being forgotten, of fading away alone, weighed heavily on it. But even in its despair, the dragon noticed something different that day. From the sky, a small metallic ship descended, kicking up dust as it landed near the edge of the valley. The dragon had not seen humans on this planet before, at least not for many decades. Its instinct was to hide, to watch from the shadows, to avoid whatever had come so close. Yet something about the movement of the ship and the careful steps of the human who emerged made the dragon pause. Unlike the creatures it had encountered before, this human did not carry weapons, and there was a strange calmness in the way they moved. The dragon watched silently as the human approached the valley floor. The human carried small containers, possibly tools or supplies, and seemed more curious than afraid. The dragon, though weak, felt an unfamiliar flicker of hope. Could this visitor bring something it had not had for 100 years? The dragon's mind raced, cautious but curious. For decades, it had given up expecting kindness, yet something in the human's actions suggested a different intention. The days that followed were tense and quiet. The dragon would watch from a distance as the human explored the valley, sometimes speaking softly to themselves or examining the dry ground as if trying to understand it. There was no threat in their movements, no aggression, only careful observation. The dragon, who had long avoided contact, found itself drawn to the human's presence. Perhaps after a century of isolation and suffering, the dragon was beginning to trust again. It moved closer, keeping hidden behind rocks, measuring the human's actions before making any decision. The human also noticed the dragon eventually. At first, they were cautious, recognizing that this was no ordinary creature. Its eyes glowed faintly in the sun, its scales shimmered, and the faint aura of heat around it made the air shimmer. Yet the human did not retreat or show fear. Instead, they observed quietly, as if trying to understand the dragon rather than dominate it. This alone made the dragon pause. It had been feared for so long, misunderstood, and hunted by those who only saw its strength. But this human seemed different. Gentle in a way it had not seen for a century. It was the beginning of a slow, silent connection. The dragon, who had lived over 100 years tormented by thirst, began to allow itself a small curiosity. The human moved through the valley, carrying water and tools, repairing small machines and surveying the land, but never harming anything. The dragon began to approach cautiously at night, drinking dew from rocks and watching the human work. Something inside the dragon stirred an old hope, faint but persistent, that perhaps this human could bring what it had been denied for a century: relief. That first part of their story ends with the dragon sitting at the edge of the valley, wings folded, eyes fixed on the human. It is wary, yet something in its long-suffering heart begins to soften. The dragon is still thirsty, still weak, but for the first time in over 100 years, it feels that maybe, just maybe, its endless struggle could have an end. The bond, though unspoken and fragile, begins to form, setting the stage for a meeting that would change both their lives forever. The human mechanic had arrived on the dry planet with a purpose, but it was curiosity and an unshakable sense of empathy that truly guided their steps. Unlike many who came to explore or exploit, the mechanic moved with care, observing the land and the creatures within it rather than rushing to impose themselves. Each morning, they would check the instruments on their small craft, repairing engines and scanning the environment for resources. But over time, a new focus began to take shape: a large, solitary shadow that moved across the valley floor, barely visible in the distance. At first, the human thought it might be a geological formation or a trick of the sunlight, but after several days, the shadow shifted in ways that no rock ever could. The mechanic was cautious but intrigued. They had worked with machines for years and studied planets for decades, yet nothing in their experience matched the presence of this creature. It was massive, its silver scales catching the sun like mirrored shields, and its eyes glowed faintly even in daylight. There was a strange elegance to its movements, despite the weariness that seemed to slow it down. The mechanic realized that approaching it would be dangerous. Many explorers had lost their lives trying to capture or confront wild creatures, But something inside the mechanic insisted that this was different. There was a sadness in the way the dragon moved, a quiet suffering that begged for understanding rather than fear. Each day, the human inched closer, leaving small traces of water or tools near rocks and observing from a distance. The dragon noticed these gestures, and at first was suspicious. It had survived centuries by trusting no one. Each encounter with a traveler or hunter ended in disappointment or danger. Yet there was something different about this human. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their hands gentle, and their voice soft when they spoke aloud, even though the dragon could not understand the words. Over time, the dragon began to recognize patterns, realizing that the human meant no harm. The dragon's curiosity grew, though it still stayed hidden behind rocks and cliffs, observing. It had been so long since it had felt safe around another being. Years of solitude had made the dragon cautious to the point of instinct. The slightest misstep could lead to injury or worse, and after surviving a century of harsh conditions, it knew the cost of vulnerability. Yet, the human's calm persistence sparked something new. It was a faint glimmer, a tiny spark of hope that perhaps not all who came to this barren world sought only profit or dominance. The human mechanic also faced challenges. The planet was unforgiving. Heat waves would scorch the landscape during the day, and cold nights would freeze exposed equipment. Supplies were limited, and the isolation weighed heavily. Often, they worked alone, repairing engines and testing instruments, talking softly to themselves to pass the long hours. Despite these hardships, the mechanic felt a strange connection to the valley, to the traces of life hidden among the dust and rocks. And each day, they left small containers of water and minerals near places they suspected the dragon might visit. They were unsure if the creature would ever drink, but the effort mattered, a silent promise that someone cared. One evening, after a long day of exploration, the mechanic noticed movement near a dry riverbed. The dragon had approached, cautiously, watching the human from a distance. Its silver scales shimmered as the last rays of sunlight caught them. The human froze for a moment, holding a container of water carefully in their hands. Neither moved, as if both were weighing the decision of trust. Slowly, the dragon lowered its massive head, eyes locked on the liquid, yet muscles tense, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. For the first time in over a century, the dragon considered the possibility that it could drink without fear of pain or betrayal. The human, sensing the hesitation, did not move forward or make sudden gestures. They simply sat down, legs crossed, and placed the water on the ground, leaving a safe distance. Their eyes met the dragon's, and though no words were exchanged, there was an understanding, a shared acknowledgement of patience and care. The dragon's tongue flicked toward the water, tasting it briefly before pulling back. It was enough to bring a faint shimmer of relief. Though the thirst was far from gone, the mechanic watched intently, taking careful notes of the dragon's reaction, the environment, and the small movements it made. They understood that a creature that had survived for a century under extreme thirst would not accept help easily. Trust could not be forced. Every day, they repeated the ritual, sometimes moving containers of water, other times leaving simple mineral solutions, always observing without imposing. Slowly, the dragon began to recognize that the human's intentions were consistent. There was no sudden attack, no tricks, only patience at night. The dragon retreated to the shadows, curling its long body around itself. Yet even in its hiding, it felt a strange sense of comfort. The human's presence lingered in its mind, a quiet reminder that maybe, after all these years, it was not entirely alone. For the first time in decades, the dragon imagined a possibility beyond mere survival. Perhaps there could be care. Perhaps there could be relief. The notion was so foreign that it took time to accept. Centuries of suffering could not be erased instantly, But the seed of trust had been planted. As days turned into weeks, the dragon's visits became more frequent. It would stay hidden while watching the human work, sometimes inching closer, sometimes retreating when a sudden sound startled it. The human noticed subtle changes. The dragon's eyes seemed more alert, its movements slightly more fluid, and its fire flickering weakly in its throat after long periods of rest. These were signs that the dragon's health was not entirely beyond help. Encouraged, the mechanic began experimenting with different minerals and purified liquids, carefully observing which ones the dragon might accept. It was delicate work, requiring patience, knowledge, and empathy. The valley began to feel alive again, not with the roar of the dragon's fire or the rush of water, but with quiet connection. The human would hum softly while working, and the dragon began to respond to the sound. It was a strange bond, silent yet profound, forming over weeks of mutual observation. The mechanic learned the dragon's routines, and the dragon learned that the human's presence did not signal danger. A silent rhythm developed between them, a dance of patience and care, both sides feeling the fragile trust grow. One afternoon, as a dust storm swept across the valley, the dragon stayed close, hidden in a narrow cave, while the human secured tools and equipment. The roar of the wind and the sharp bite of sand reminded the dragon of the harshness of life it had endured alone. Yet seeing the human move calmly, protecting their supplies and remaining steady, the dragon felt a strange reassurance. Perhaps it had been too long since it relied on another being, but maybe this human could be different. It was the first time in over a century that the dragon felt something like hope, not just survival, but a small flicker that life could be better. The days that followed strengthened this silent partnership. The human would explore further valleys, leaving markers and small amounts of water in strategic places. The dragon would follow at a distance, sometimes drinking the water cautiously when alone, and sometimes merely observing. Their interactions were brief but meaningful, each learning from the other. The human's patience and ingenuity began to chip away at the dragon's fear, and the dragon's cautious trust reminded the human why empathy mattered more than technology or speed. By the end of this period, the dragon had changed subtly. Its eyes were brighter, its movements slightly stronger, and for the first time in decades, it lifted its head without immediately searching for shelter. The human had not forced it, had not demanded obedience or submission. Instead, through patience, observation, and consistent care, a bridge had formed between two very different beings. The valley, once silent and desolate, was now a place where the dragon's long-suffering spirit could begin to heal. And the human mechanic had become the first true companion it had known in over 100 years. The story of Part 2 ends here with the dragon and the human silently acknowledging each other's presence. The first real connection in over a century. The dragon's thirst remained, its suffering still real, but the first steps toward trust and understanding had been made. A bond was forming, one that would ultimately lead to relief, hope, and a life neither of them could have imagined before their paths crossed in this remote, barren valley. The dragon had been watching the human for weeks now. From the shadows of jagged cliffs, it observed every movement, every careful step, every small gesture. Its massive wings stayed folded, its long tail curled around its body, and its eyes, though glowing faintly, were filled with caution. It had lived over a century in a world that gave it nothing but suffering, and trust was a word it barely remembered. Yet something about this human was different. There was no aggression in their approach, no loud commands or sudden movements. The human moved as if respecting the valley itself, as if it were part of a larger rhythm that the dragon had long forgotten. The human, for their part, had grown more confident in their observations. Every day, they would explore a little farther, leaving small containers of water, some purified and others mixed with minerals, the dragon might find easier to digest. Each evening, they would settle near a small rock formation, quietly taking notes, sometimes speaking softly aloud. The human had begun to notice subtle signs, the dragon's tail twitching when it was near, the slight tilt of its head, the way its eyes followed movements even when it remained hidden. These were small victories, but to the human, they meant progress. One afternoon, the dragon sensed a shift. The human had left a container of water at the edge of a shallow crevice, and then retreated to a distance, sitting still, waiting. For the first time in decades, the dragon considered approaching openly. Its instincts screamed caution, but the endless thirst had grown unbearable. Every bone in its body ached for relief. Every dry scale screamed for moisture. The dragon lowered its massive head slightly, testing the air, testing the human. There was no sudden movement, no sign of threat. Slowly, carefully, it stepped forward, each movement deliberate, each step measured. The human noticed immediately. Their body froze, but there was no fear in their eyes, only patience. They had learned the dragon's rhythm, the subtle cues that indicated it was ready to trust, even in the smallest way. The human extended a hand toward the water, keeping it low and visible, a silent invitation. The dragon's nostrils flared as it inhaled the scent, feeling the faint traces of minerals mixed in the liquid. It hesitated, hovering on the edge of fear and desire. And then, after what felt like hours, it lowered its head and took the first careful sip. The water touched its tongue. And for the first time in over 100 years, the dragon felt a tiny spark of relief. It was fleeting, almost too brief to notice, but enough to make its body shiver in pleasure. Its eyes softened slightly, and for a moment it felt something it had not felt in decades' trust. The human did not move. They remained seated, quiet, allowing the dragon to drink at its own pace. There was no rush, no impatience, only calm acceptance. The dragon drank again, more confidently, and then again, until the water in the container was gone. The relief was not complete, but it was enough to stir a new feeling, a fragile hope that someone cared, that someone could help. The dragon withdrew slightly, its massive body retreating to a safe distance, but its eyes remained fixed on the human. There was no threat in the human's face, only a quiet pride in the progress they had achieved. For the first time, the dragon understood that this being was not like the others. It was not there to hunt, to capture, or to exploit. The human had come with a purpose, yes, but that purpose was not destruction. It was care, observation, and perhaps, in a strange way, companionship. Days passed like this, each one reinforcing the fragile bond between the two. The dragon began to trust the human more openly, lingering closer, watching their movements with curiosity rather than fear. It learned to recognize the signs that the human intended to help, the way they placed water, the careful notes they took, the quiet hum of their voice as they worked. The dragon's body began to regain some strength, the scales reflecting sunlight more brightly, the fire in its throat flickering faintly, as if acknowledging the human's presence. The human, in turn, became more attuned to the dragon's needs. They experimented carefully, mixing minerals and purified liquids, watching for reactions. Every slight improvement, every flicker of trust was a victory. The human realized that this was not a creature to be tamed or forced. It was a being that had suffered beyond comprehension and deserved patience, respect, and understanding. The dragon responded to this patience, its once cautious movements becoming slightly more fluid, its eyes brighter and its body less tense. One evening, as the twin suns began to set, painting the valley in shades of orange and pink, the dragon made a bold decision. It approached the human fully, its massive head lowered in submission, yet not fear. The human remained seated, calm and still, allowing the dragon to come as close as it wished. The dragon's claws made soft indentations in the dirt as it stepped forward, each movement deliberate and cautious. When it finally reached the human, it lowered its head, letting the human touch the top of its snout. There was a moment of connection, a silent understanding that both had waited a long time for this moment. The human placed their hand gently on the dragon's snout, feeling the warmth of its scales and the subtle tremor of muscles still weakened from centuries of thirst. The dragon did not flinch. Instead, it closed its eyes briefly, a gesture of trust that it had not shown to any being in over 100 years. The human smiled softly, whispering words the dragon could not understand, but somehow felt in its chest. For the first time, the dragon allowed itself to feel safe, even vulnerable. Knowing that this human meant no harm. Over the following weeks, their interactions grew more natural. The dragon would linger near the human's camp, drinking water at intervals, watching as the human repaired instruments and maintained their ship. The human would talk softly while working, narrating tasks or commenting on the environment. The dragon responded in small ways, flicking its tail, shifting closer, occasionally letting out a low, rumbling sound that seemed almost like a purr. It was a fragile friendship, built slowly, day by day, on the foundation of patience, care, and understanding. The dragon began to test the limits of this trust. It allowed the human to place water directly near it, sometimes even letting the human stroke the scales along its neck. Each gesture was small but monumental, the culmination of decades of suffering and solitude. The human remained careful, always respecting boundaries, never rushing, never demanding more than the dragon could offer. It was a lesson in empathy, a reminder that healing could not be forced, but only nurtured with patience and compassion. One day, a storm swept across the valley, bringing strong winds and a sudden, heavy dustfall. The dragon huddled close to the rocks, shielding itself as best it could, while the human worked to secure tools and equipment. In the chaos, the dragon realized something new. It trusted the human to care for it even in danger. It did not flee blindly. It did not lash out. Instead, it stayed close, observing, feeling a bond that had grown stronger than mere survival instinct. The human had become a part of its life, a rare presence that brought comfort instead of fear. As the storm passed and the skies cleared, the dragon emerged from its shelter. Its scales shimmered in the sunlight, its eyes brighter than before, and its fire flickered faintly, a sign of strength returning. The human watched with satisfaction, noting the changes, understanding that this was only the beginning. The dragon had survived a century of torment, yet now, for the first time, it faced the possibility of relief, of companionship, of life beyond mere endurance. The story of Part 3 ends with a moment of quiet triumph. The dragon and the human sit near the edge of the valley, the wind blowing gently across the rocks, both aware of the fragile bond that has formed. The dragon's thirst remains. Its suffering is far from over, but trust has been established. The first true encounter has occurred, one built not on fear, not on domination, but on patience, empathy, and understanding. It is a turning point, a moment that will change the lives of both the dragon and the human forever. After the first cautious encounter, the bond between the human and the dragon began to grow in ways neither had expected. The dragon, still wary but slowly trusting, began to show signs of curiosity about the human's actions. Every day, it would linger closer, observing the tools, the containers, and the careful experiments with minerals and water the human conducted. The human had realized that ordinary water was not enough for the dragon. After 100 years of suffering, its body had adapted to survive on almost nothing, but it could not drink normally like other creatures. The human knew it would take more than patience. It would take careful study, creativity, and understanding of the dragon's unique needs. The human started by observing the dragon closely, noting its reactions to different liquids. Sometimes a sip of pure water would make the dragon's eyes brighten slightly, only for it to pull back before the relief could fully reach its body. Sometimes mineral solutions, carefully mixed, would make the dragon hold still, almost savoring the sensation for a brief moment. The human kept meticulous notes, taking careful measurements and experimenting with tiny variations. They were determined to understand what the dragon needed, not to force it, and every small success was celebrated silently. A step toward easing centuries of torment. The dragon, though cautious, seemed to recognize the effort. It began to allow the human to place liquids closer, even leaving small containers nearby while it observed. There was no sudden friendliness, no bursts of affection, only a steady acknowledgement that this being did not intend harm. Slowly, the dragon began to trust the human's presence in ways it had not trusted anyone for decades. The nights that were once spent hiding in solitude were now shared. In a quiet distance, with the dragon watching the human work, sometimes resting its head near a rock, keeping a watchful eye, each day brought a little progress. The human learned that certain minerals helped the dragon's body absorb liquid more effectively. They experimented with different temperatures and textures, offering small amounts of water mixed with nutrients. The dragon responded subtly slight twitches of its tail, the softening of its eyes, even the gentle flicker of heat in its throat. It was a slow process, but both were patient. The human understood that the dragon's body had been deprived for so long that immediate relief was impossible. They approached the challenge with care, adjusting slowly, allowing the dragon to lead whenever it felt comfortable. One afternoon, the dragon allowed the human to come closer than ever before. Its massive head hovered over a small container of water mixed with carefully balanced minerals, and the human held the container steadily. The dragon sniffed cautiously, then dipped its tongue into the liquid. The relief was immediate, but still fleeting. The dragon's eyes softened, and a low rumble escaped its throat, a sound that seemed almost like gratitude. The human, understanding the significance, remained perfectly still, letting the dragon drink at its own pace. This moment was more than nourishment. It was a breakthrough in trust and understanding. The dragon's body slowly began to recover. Its scales became more lustrous, reflecting the sunlight more vividly. Its movements, once slow and deliberate from weakness, became slightly more fluid. Even the fire that had nearly faded from its throat began to flicker again, a sign of strength returning. Yet the dragon remained cautious. Centuries of suffering could not be erased in a few days, and it continued to maintain a distance, always aware that the world could turn dangerous at any moment. The human respected this, never forcing contact, never rushing progress, and always offering care at a pace the dragon could accept on at night. The valley was quiet, the stars glinting above as if watching the unfolding bond. The dragon would rest near the rocks, observing the human as they repaired tools or studied the minerals. Occasionally, the human would speak softly, narrating their tasks or commenting on the conditions, and the dragon seemed to respond in subtle ways: a flick of the tail, a shift in position, a low, rumbling sound. The valley, once desolate and silent, was now filled with the quiet rhythm of mutual understanding. Both had learned to recognize the other's needs, to respect boundaries, and to celebrate small victories together. The human also began to understand more about the dragon's condition. It was not simply thirst. It was a rare physiological adaptation that had made survival nearly impossible. The dragon's body could absorb minimal moisture from food and air, but regular liquids passed through without providing true relief. The human carefully crafted mixtures, experimenting with minerals, temperature, and slight adjustments in concentration. Each small success taught them more about the dragon's unique needs. The dragon, in turn, learned that this human was not a threat, that the liquid offered was not a trap, and that care could exist even in a harsh world. There were moments of tension, of course. The dragon sometimes pulled back suddenly, startled by sounds or memories of past betrayals. On these days, the human would give space, leaving small containers of water and retreating to a distance. The dragon would observe silently and eventually return, testing the limits of trust once more. Each test was met with patience, and slowly the dragon realized that this human did not intend harm. The valley, which had once felt like a prison of solitude, now became a place of cautious hope. One morning, after a particularly long night of preparation, the human approached the dragon with a new mixture. This one was carefully balanced to allow maximum absorption. A blend of minerals, purified water, and other elements the human had determined might finally offer significant relief. The dragon observed silently, muscles tense, eyes glowing softly in anticipation. Slowly, it dipped its tongue into the liquid. The human watched carefully, noting every reaction, every subtle movement. For the first time, the dragon drank with confidence, savoring the sensation. Relief spread through its body, faint but undeniable, a promise that its suffering might finally ease. The dragon's trust deepened after this moment. It began to allow the human to place liquids closer, even observing the preparations with interest. The human, in turn, remained patient, understanding that centuries of deprivation required steady, careful nurturing. Their bond grew stronger, built on mutual respect and understanding, on the recognition that trust could not be demanded but only earned. The dragon had endured unimaginable suffering, yet in this quiet valley, it had found someone who was willing to meet it on its own terms. Over time, the valley transformed into a place of quiet recovery. The dragon's body grew stronger, its eyes brighter, and its fire flickered more consistently. The human continued their careful experiments, always observing, always respecting boundaries, and always offering care at a pace the dragon could accept. Together, they navigated the delicate balance of survival and healing, each learning from the other, each contributing to a bond that transcended species and circumstance. The story of Part 4 ends with a sense of fragile triumph. The dragon, though still recovering, had begun to experience true relief for the first time in over a century. Its trust in the human had deepened, and the human had learned the importance of patience, empathy, and careful observation. The valley, once desolate and harsh, now held the promise of hope, recovery, and the possibility that even the most tormented beings could find comfort when someone dared to care. The days of preparation and careful patience finally led to a moment the human had been working toward for weeks. The dragon, which had lived over 100 years in relentless thirst, was now calmer, more confident, and beginning to trust the human fully. Its massive eyes, which had once glowed with suspicion and weariness, now carried a faint warmth, a hint that the centuries of suffering could finally be eased. The human had studied the dragon's reactions to different liquids and minerals, combining their knowledge with careful observation until they had crafted a mixture that might finally bring the creature real relief. That morning, the valley was quiet, except for the distant sound of wind brushing against the rocks. The human approached slowly, carrying a specially prepared container. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. The dragon watched from a safe distance, muscles tense but eyes curious. It had learned over decades that care often came with danger, that kindness could be a trick, and that trust had to be earned slowly. Yet something about the human's steady movements and calm demeanor reassured it. The dragon lowered its head slightly, signaling that it was willing to participate, but it remained alert, ready to withdraw if necessary. The human set the container on the ground carefully, making sure it was stable and accessible. They stepped back slightly, giving the dragon enough space to approach. There was no rush, no demand, only patience. The dragon sniffed the liquid, its nostrils flaring as it assessed the mixture. Slowly, almost tentatively, it extended its tongue, dipping it into the water for the first time. The sensation was immediate and profound. Relief coursed through its body, spreading from its throat to every limb, warming muscles that had long been tense from dehydration. Its eyes softened, a rare expression of comfort after more than a century of suffering. The dragon drank again, more confidently this time, savoring the sensation. The human watched closely, heart pounding with quiet excitement. They knew this was more than just a sip of water. It was a turning point, a moment where centuries of pain could finally begin to ease. The dragon's body responded almost immediately. Its scales reflected the sunlight more vividly. Its fire flickered faintly in its throat, and the muscles along its wings relaxed. For the first time in 100 years, the dragon could feel the difference between survival and comfort. The relief was not only physical, but emotional. The dragon had spent decades alone, tormented by thirst and isolation. Even in moments of minimal survival, it had longed for a connection, for someone who might understand its struggle. Now, sitting near the human and drinking from the carefully prepared mixture, it felt something entirely new: hope. It realized that it was not alone, that care could exist in this harsh world, and that it might finally experience life in a way it had thought impossible. As the dragon drank, the human spoke softly, narrating their observations, explaining in quiet words what they had done to create this mixture. The dragon did not understand the words, but it understood the intention. There was no danger, no trick, only a deliberate effort to bring relief. The dragon lowered its massive body further, settling near the human, letting its head rest briefly on the ground as it drank. It was a gesture of trust so profound that it took decades of isolation, suffering, and caution to achieve. The human remained still, careful not to startle the dragon, allowing the creature to experience the relief fully without interruption. Hours passed in a quiet rhythm. The dragon drank intermittently, resting in between, and gradually its strength began to return. Its movements became less strained, its massive wings flexed more easily, and the heat in its throat flickered like a weak but steady flame. The human continued to observe, making careful notes, adjusting small elements in the mixture for future sessions, but never rushing, never imposing. Every reaction, every sign of comfort was a victory. The dragon had endured 100 years of torment, and now, for the first time, it could feel what life might be like when relief was real. The bond between them deepened in ways that went beyond survival. The dragon, once cautious and distant, now allowed the human to approach it more closely, even touching the container as if acknowledging the effort behind it. There was no fear. In its gaze, only a growing understanding that the human had become a part of its life, a companion in a world that had long been devoid of care. The human, in turn, felt a profound connection, realizing that their patience, empathy, and careful observation had brought a creature back from the brink of suffering. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, patience, and understanding, something rare, fragile, and deeply rewarding. By the afternoon, the dragon had grown stronger. Its scales shimmered with renewed vitality, its fire flickered more consistently, and it moved with greater ease across the valley floor. It had begun to trust the human completely, no longer retreating at sudden movements or sounds. The human approached slowly, placing another container of water nearby, and the dragon drank without hesitation. Each sip reinforced the bond. Each moment of trust strengthened the connection. For the first time in over a century, the dragon could imagine a life that was not defined solely by thirst, struggle, and solitude. The human's care extended beyond just providing water. They studied the valley, finding shaded spots, hidden crevices, and small areas where moisture could accumulate naturally. They showed the dragon how to access these resources safely, without pressure, allowing the creature to learn at its own pace. The dragon began to follow the human's guidance, exploring areas it had avoided for decades, discovering the valley in a new way. Every small success was celebrated silently between them, a quiet recognition of the progress made together. The relief was transformative. The dragon, once tormented and frail, began to exhibit signs of its old strength and agility. Its movements became more fluid, its eyes brighter, and its fire, once dimmed by exhaustion and dehydration, flickered steadily, warming the surrounding air. The human observed with careful joy, knowing that this moment was the culmination of weeks of patience, observation, and careful experimentation. It was not just the water that had changed the dragon. It was the trust, the care, and the consistency that had finally allowed the creature to feel safe and understood. That evening, as the twin suns set over the valley, the dragon settled near the human, resting its massive head on the ground close to them. There was no need for words. The quiet presence, the mutual understanding, the long journey from isolation, and suffering to trust and relief spoke louder than anything could be said. For the first time in over 100 years, the dragon felt truly at ease. Its body was nourished, its thirst partially quenched, and its heart lighter from the bond formed with this human who had refused to give up on it. The story of Part 5 ends with a sense of profound triumph. The dragon, after a century of torment, had finally experienced true relief. Its body and spirit began to recover, and it had learned that trust, patience, and care could exist even in the harshest conditions. The human had become a companion, a guide, and a source of hope, proving that empathy and understanding could overcome suffering that had lasted a lifetime. This pivotal moment marked a turning point, not just in the dragon's life, but in the valley itself, which had transformed from a place of desolation and despair into one of quiet recovery and connection. After weeks of careful care, patience, and observation, the dragon had begun to transform in ways that were impossible to ignore. Its massive body, once frail and tense from a century of relentless thirst, now moved with a renewed strength. The silver scales, dulled from decades of survival without true hydration, shimmered brilliantly in the sunlight. Even the fire that had nearly faded from its throat flickered steadily now, a symbol of life returning to a creature that had spent 100 years in suffering. The valley itself seemed different, as if it too had felt the change, the rocks and dry earth softened by small pools of moisture the human had created. The air filled with a sense of calm, a quiet energy that suggested hope and renewal. The human had become an integral part of the dragon's life. What had started as cautious observation had evolved into a bond that was both quiet and profound. Each day, the human would prepare mixtures of water and minerals, leaving them in places the dragon could access safely. The dragon no longer approached with hesitation. It would move through the valley confidently, lowering its massive head to drink, its eyes bright, its body relaxed. There were still moments of wariness, remnants of centuries of suffering, but they were fleeting, replaced by an ever-growing trust that this human had proven again and again. The dragon began to explore areas it had avoided for decades. Cliffs it once skirted cautiously, caves it never entered, and distant valleys that had always seemed unreachable were now familiar territory. The human followed, not to control or command, but to ensure safety and provide assistance if needed. This partnership was delicate, built on respect, patience, and empathy, and it allowed the dragon to experience a freedom it had not known in 100 years. Each flight across the valley, each sweep of its wings, was a testament to the recovery of body and spirit that the human also observed changes beyond the physical. The dragon's behavior shifted in subtle ways. Its posture relaxed, the flicker of fire in its throat became consistent, and it began to communicate in small, meaningful gestures. Low rumbles, gentle movements of the tail, and the careful tilt of its head became a silent language the human began to understand. Every action reinforced the bond they had built, showing that trust, once earned, could create a relationship that transcended species. The dragon had learned to rely on the human, not out of fear or necessity, but because of the care and patience that had been offered without expectation. One morning, the human prepared a particularly significant mixture. This blend had been carefully perfected over weeks of trial and observation, combining minerals, purified water, and other nutrients designed to finally bring the dragon full relief. The dragon approached without hesitation, its eyes reflecting a calm understanding that this was not a test or threat. As it drank, the relief spread fully through its body for the first time in over a century. Muscles that had been stiff and sore relaxed completely, scales gleamed brilliantly, and its fire ignited stronger than it had in decades. The dragon lowered its head to the ground and let out a deep, resonant rumble, a sound that carried the weight of centuries of suffering finally lifted. This moment marked a turning point. The dragon, once tormented and isolated, now experienced something entirely new: peace. Its thirst, which had defined its existence for so long, was no longer a constant torment. The valley that had seemed empty and harsh was now a place of life, vibrancy, and possibility. The human watched, heart full, knowing that all the careful planning, patience, and empathy had led to this triumph. The dragon had been given not just relief, but the chance to experience life fully again, a chance to heal both body and spirit. In the days that followed, the dragon's confidence continued to grow. It began to approach the human more openly, allowing gentle touches along its massive neck and head. The human had never forced contact, never demanded submission or obedience, and the dragon responded with trust that had been impossible a month before. Together, they explored the valley and its hidden corners, discovering natural springs, shaded areas, and small pools of water that the dragon could now access with ease. Each day was a journey of discovery and recovery, not just for the dragon, but for the human as well. The bond between them became almost intuitive. The dragon would anticipate the human's movements, lowering its head when it saw the container of water prepared, or following silently when the human moved across the valley. The human, in turn, understood the dragon's subtle cues, adjusting the mixtures, preparing safe resting spots, and observing its behavior for signs of discomfort or need. This delicate balance, built over weeks of careful patience, created a partnership that was rare and profound, a true connection between species, grounded in trust, empathy, and shared experience. The dragon's recovery was complete in both body and spirit. Its massive wings allowed it to soar across the valley with strength and grace, muscles flexing with fluid motion. Its scales sparkled in the sunlight, eyes gleamed with vitality, and fire burned steadily in its throat. But beyond the physical changes, the dragon had regained something far more important: a sense of belonging and hope. It had endured centuries of suffering, yet now it had a companion, a guide, and a friend who had shown that care could exist even in the harshest conditions. The human observed all of this quietly, understanding that the dragon's journey was not just about hydration or nutrition. It was about trust, patience, and the power of empathy. They had witnessed a transformation that went beyond the physical. The dragon's spirit, once weighed down by a century of torment, had begun to shine. The human had given the dragon more than water. They had given it the chance to heal, to hope, and to experience life fully once more. Even the valley seemed to respond to the dragon's recovery. Plants near the water sources grew more robust. Small pools reflected the sunlight, and the air carried a sense of calm energy. It was as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the dragon's suffering to end so that life could flourish again. The human and dragon, together, had created not just relief for a single creature, but a small oasis of care and renewal in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving world. As the twin suns began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the dragon settled near the human. Its massive head rested gently on the ground, close enough to feel the human's presence, yet with enough space to maintain comfort. The human, sitting nearby, watched quietly, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. They had nurtured, observed, and guided this creature through centuries of suffering. And now, for the first time, the dragon could experience life without constant torment. The bond they had formed was unspoken yet complete, a testament to patience, empathy, and care. The dragon let out a low, contented rumble, a sound that carried the weight of 100 years of endurance and the relief of finally being understood. The human smiled softly, reaching out to rest a hand gently on the dragon's massive head. There was no fear, no hesitation, only mutual recognition of the journey they had shared. The valley, once silent and desolate, now resonated with quiet harmony, a living proof of what could be achieved when patience, trust, and compassion were offered without expectation. In the days that followed, the dragon continued to thrive. It drank freely from the mixtures prepared by the human, explored the valley with ease, and even began to playfully chase small shadows cast by the setting suns. The human continued to observe, always cautious, always respectful, but there was no longer the tension of fear or distrust. The valley was a shared space, a home of healing and recovery, and the bond between human and dragon had become a symbol of hope. The story concludes with the dragon fully recovered, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The century-long torment that had defined its life was finally behind it. The human, through patience, careful observation, and unwavering empathy, had given the dragon more than water. They had given it trust, companionship, and the possibility of a life filled with relief, hope, and freedom. The valley, once harsh and unforgiving, had become a place of healing, a living testament to what could be achieved when care was given selflessly and patience guided every action. For the first time in over 100 years, the dragon was free from suffering, free to trust, and free to live fully. And in that quiet valley, a bond was forged that neither time nor hardship could break, a bond that reminded both human and dragon that even the deepest wounds could be healed when someone dared to care.